We've never met or had a conversation, but when I saw your bio, the things you stood for, the things you're campaigning on, I really wanted to connect. But before we get to all the endeavors you're in now, I really want to start from the beginning to contextualize your journey into where you are at now and your visions for Los Angeles. So can you tell us about your upbringing, where you grew up, and some pivotal moments that shaped you?
So I was born in Alabama, but actually grew up in Florida. I usually tell people I'm from Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, partially because I spent about a third to a fourth of a year at my grandmother's house during the summer, and we often went there for homecoming, for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, for Easter. I was basically in Alabama all the time, and a significant proportion of my family lives in Florida. Um, Growing up was great in the country, but it really sort of shaped me in a way that is really hard to describe simply. My grandmother was really one of the greatest examples that I've ever had. She was very connected to everyone in the community, and she had a general interest in making sure that everyone in the community was protected. She even went to the older people, and she was old by the time I really knew her. She was in her 60s to start. She died when she was 87. But she would regularly go to all of the older people in the community, making sure that they were being fed, cleaning their houses if there was something wrong. And she would actually go visit other people's children, grandchildren, uncles, husbands, etc., if they were in jail or prison, because other people were not able to. I had the opportunity to actually give her a eulogy. And, one of the running jokes in my family is that I was her favorite. Not her favorite grandchild, not her favorite great-grandchild, not her favorite child, just her favorite, period, and the number one in her heart. But in my eulogy, I basically said that she made everybody feel like that because she showed everybody the type of care and attention that people need to feel confident and secure and move forward. And that's really the example that my mother emulated and a number of other people in my family emulated, and something that I never did consciously. But, in my family, it was always sort of unsaid, like if people need help and you have the energy or the resources to help them, you do it.
So obviously, I can only imagine what life was like for your grandma. She grew up in Alabama.
She grew up in Alabama. She was also actually a part of the Montgomery bus boycott, where I met her. We were actually in the country in between Tuskegee, Alabama and Union Springs, Alabama. But in her younger life, she lived in Montgomery. She knew Martin Luther King Jr., and she knew Rosa Parks, who has a house in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is, I'm not sure if it's a historical site, but it's a site for Black Americans.
So how important was knowing your history, what your grandma went through, what other people in that all over the country, but especially in the deep South went through? How did that kind of shape you, and why is really diving into knowing, as you mentioned, true history important?
I think true history is important for a lot of different reasons. We weren't really sure about it at the time, but my mom and my grandma, before the internet, always had World Book encyclopedias. But one of the things that my grandmother had that was particularly instructive and I think influenced my mom quite a bit is she had this Encyclopedia of Black Americans, which was something that was not, widely held. It was widely distributed. Not everyone had it though. And there was a point in my life when I was an overeager young person where I read the encyclopedia from A to Z. And then I went on to different encyclopedias to see if they had different information. And the Black Encyclopedia actually taught me a lot. One of the things that my mom did with my sister and I'm not sure if she did it with my older brothers, is that in between school years, she would actually assign us Black history homework. She would just seek it out. It was stuff that we did not really experience in school. You know, we learned about Mary McLeod Bethune. We learned about George Washington Carver, who has a museum at Tuskegee University. We learned about like all these different inventions that not only Black Americans made, but Africans made that weren't actually really recorded in the history that we were taught in school. So learning that history really showed me what we are capable of as Black people in the United States, in contrast to what the normal American history taught us, that it was just a couple people in the 50s and 60s who were like, we can't take this. We really learned that there was a history of resistance and there was a history of self-advocacy for system change for Black people pre-slavery, through Reconstruction, and it had never stopped. And that was very instructive to me. People had always been struggling. People had always been pushing forward. And that was something that really resonated with me as really sort of a standard to live up to.
Growing up, did you have any, I know I'm sure your grandma and your mom were one, any specific mentors or people that really guided you along the way to help you become the person you are?
Growing up, my primary mentors were my grandmother and my mother. They weren't exactly mentors on purpose, but they always really showed me where to go and how to treat people. The one thing that I took note of in particular was the people who they venerated. And there was this radio program that played every Martin Luther King Jr. birthday season that was King from Atlanta to the Mountaintop. And it was something that my grandmother really cherished. So it was something that I listened to deeply. It was an audio documentary. I think it's like 6 to 8 hours long. But they usually played it in parts on Black radio stations throughout the MLK weekend and before. And from that, you know, I got really into Martin Luther King Jr. and really into the specifics of what he said beyond the I Have a Dream speech. As I said, my grandmother was part of the Montgomery bus boycott. And she spoke about him highly because of her experience of hearing him personally. And thanks to YouTube and other websites, I've been able to hear speeches that I've only seen quoted, ones that go beyond I Have a Dream, ones that talk about the systemic inequities of poverty and the lack of healthcare and constant war. And those are things that aren't often spoken about when it comes to Martin Luther King Jr. So he was more of a guide for me beyond my mother and my grandmother, but my mother and my grandmother were my primary mentors.
Historically, just real quick, talking about MLK, a lot of people say he was, they were all supportive when he was talking about peace and love, but a lot of the stuff he was doing was bringing together poor Appalachia in different aspects of the class economy to really start pulling on those levers. Do you have any historical information about that?
Well, a lot of people who say that they or their family supported Martin Luther King Jr. when he was talking about just Black liberation or poverty are frankly lying. A lot of people, even before Martin Luther King Jr. started talking about foreign policy and international relations, thought he was asking for too much too soon. Historically, a lot of people like to compare Malcolm X and MLK and see them as, in a dichotomous relationship. But if you look at what they said, especially towards the end of their lives, a lot of what they say is the same. A lot of what they say is about people being exploited because they are poor. A lot of what they say is about people being exploited because they are Black, because they are women, etc. And a lot of people hated Martin Luther King Jr. for what he said, because he exposed the reality in this country that it has always been classist, that the people who are at the bottom have always been working for less than they deserve for people who don't work at all, and that both race and gender and sexuality play into that. And these were not things that people wanted to hear. So, in sort of the backwards look at history, people like to contrast Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. But if you listen to their speeches towards the end, Malcolm X, who did not want to work with white people at all when he was with the Nation of Islam at the start, became much more of a multiculturalist and actually really welcomed the opinions of everyone and recognized the importance of collective struggle. Martin Luther King Jr., who was primarily initially focused on segregation, also began to talk about economic exploitation and international exploitation and wars for money and for enterprise. And I really believe that it is that type of analysis and that type of real root call for system change that really precipitated his assassination.
And just going back into that movement in terms of the work the Black Panthers were doing and what the government did to sequester the movement, if that's the right word to say, what are your thoughts on that?
There's a lot of documentation on an FBI program called COINTELPRO. And this was a program that, Freedom of Information Act requests have really exposed. But it was basically the government trying to disrupt movements like the Civil Rights Movement, like the Women's Rights Movement, like the American Indian Movement, like the Queer Rights Movement, by internally sabotaging it, by putting different agents into it and having those agents suggest things that would really make the movements lose favor with the general public. There were also targeted assassinations, which are also documented in Freedom of Information Act requests. There was a real target on anyone working for progress who was not a white man. And that's documented in our nation's history. That's not a conspiracy theory. You can read about that at museums and in the National Archives. It's not make-believe. And I think the more that we think about that in context, the more we are critical of some of the ways in which our government justifies some of their current actions.
Any pivotal moments in high school? And then I'm interested to know about after high school, what your journey was.
So my high school experience was in the International Baccalaureate program in Florida. Florida was, let's just say, different then in terms of education. At the time, I believe it had more international baccalaureate schools than California. Now I think California is number one and Florida is number two. But the program really challenged us to be critical thinkers. In English, it challenged us to be critical in the context of who the narrator was and what their gender was. It was often a white man. In history, it challenged us to really inspect who was writing the history and who that history was for and what the agenda it might have. And that really affected the way that I view the world. I often tell people that, I went to undergrad, I've completed my master's, I completed my doctorate. My high school experience in the International Baccalaureate program was the most challenging academic test that I've had in my life. Nothing has ever compared to that, but mostly because it challenged me to think. It challenged me to consider primary and secondary sources. It challenged me to consider the particular ideology of a publication. It challenged me to consider political parties and their ideology and how that changes. And as such, I got into the world as a hypercritical person. In geography, we learned that the best way to raise the poverty level of people in developing countries was to give women contraception. And that was 11th grade. And that was something that stuck with me. And there are, similar things that happen in the context of service delivery and social work and what I'm doing now. But I really take a systems change analysis focus, primarily because of my experience in high school. There are, a number of different instances in which I saw bullying, in which I intervened, in which I saw sexism. In high school, I was a part of Youth for Gender Equality, the French Club, National Honor Society, a number of other groups, football team, football team, not basketball team, track team, cross country. I spoke with everyone, but there were a lot of opportunities for everyone to be represented. And there were a lot of opportunities and requests from my educational institution that we be critical and that we explore.
Yeah, I just want to go into the importance of understanding critical thinking, especially now with people reading less, right? Using sound bites and headlines, where basically we have revisionist history and people just using opinions as fact consistently, and there's really no conversations anymore. So this is really geared toward young people. Why is it important? And I try to connect with young people and have them read books as much as possible. Why is it important for young people to really tap into the idea of critical thinking for themselves, for their community, and for the country?
I think critical thinking is one of the most important skills that we can impart to developing children, to students. It allows them to really inspect what they are given rather than to take whatever information they receive as fact. As we know, there is a lot of misinformation that is very purposeful, coming from particular candidates, particular governments, particular institutes that are supposedly nonprofits but have a very strong agenda. And it's really hard to make sense of what is reality in the current moment. I think if students are grounded in things and they study things like disparate histories, comparative literature, that look at the representation of particular events from different perspectives and the history of events from different perspectives, it allows them to sift and to not take anything at face value and to come to their own conclusions. And often, and most importantly, when it's possible, primary sources, and that primary source being ourselves, is the most effective way to find out whether or not something is true. Because one of the ways that people divide people, and divide and conquer has been really the go-to strategy because it's incredibly effective for people in power for millennia. But one of the ways to get past divide and conquer is to meet the people on the other side, to talk to them, to let them know who you are and to find out who they are. I think once you do that, a lot of people find out that a lot of our struggles are economic. A lot of the things that could prevent things like crime, things that like mental health emergencies, things like evictions and homelessness are systemic, and they're things that we all experience. And having that ability to not only think critically, but also listen attentively and learn is one of the most important skills that we can impart to students.
Since we're talking about critical things, let's get into just branch into critical race theory, because that's obviously been in the news a lot. Can you break down what it is, what it isn't, how it's being portrayed, where it's actually being taught?
So critical race theory is not something that has been taught in most K through 12 schools. Usually it's something that people actually encounter in graduate study. Sometimes they encounter it in undergrad, but it basically says that race has been operative in the history of our country and the history of what has happened in our country. Now, if you want to take that at face value, some of the histories that we have could be construed as critical race theory, but critical race theory often gets substantively more complex. In K through 12 schools, it's incredibly important for us to identify that the history that people have been taught in the United States is Eurocentric history and to some degree propaganda. It leaves out the voices of BIPOC people, but specifically Black people who have different histories, Indigenous people who were here before and were passing down oral histories, the histories of immigrants from around the world who came to this country. There is this tendency to frame things from the far right like we won't be replaced, like we were the first people in this nation, which is an affront to Indigenous people who were here long before. And it is really just sort of nonsensical, actually. The histories that we get from a variety of different groups allow us to form a more cohesive history, a more critical history that includes all of us, all voices. One of the voices that is most often left out is that of women. If we look at history the way that we've been taught in American schools for probably a century, women are in the background, when in reality, women are the people who have actually been keeping the home together. Women are the people who've actually been working in factories in World War II. Women are the people who are uncredited writers in a significant proportion of early Hollywood movie and TV shows. Women have been contributing on a regular basis, but they've largely been left out of history. They have been an afterthought. And you can cut and paste that to any other group. People with disabilities, gay and lesbian people, trans people in particular, and every other group. So it's incredibly important for us to have a comprehensive focus on history. What critical race theory does not do is it does not blame the children of this generation for the offenses of past generations. It basically lets us know what happens, it basically lets us know what happened in the past and how what happened in the past is still operative in our current environment, in our policies on the local, state, and federal level, and in our perceptions and our stereotypes about people of particular ethnic groups, people of particular gender identities, people of particular sexualities, people of particular abilities, and very importantly for the United States, people of particular classes.
And is this really, I mean, it's kind of easy to see, but is this kind of an opportunity for them to uphold and sustain white supremacy? And because if you can alter history and the facts, then you can uphold the system you want.
Yes, I mean a lot of the effort in our country in the context of creating the story of America has been an effort to hold up white supremacy. It's been an effort to diminish the efforts of BIPOC folks, women, queer folks, disabled folks, all of which have contributed immeasurably to this country. And if you actually look at some long-range things, you'll find that things like the violin and the piano were invented in Africa. Things like complex math are Arabic. Things like noodles, came from China and Japan and were imported into Italy. But the stories that we hear are really Eurocentric and really make it seem like the first and most important contributions were made by white people. And though there have been important contributions by white people, there have been important contributions by indigenous Asians, indigenous South Americans and Americans, and of course, Africans.
And real quick on that, any specific books that you'd quickly recommend?
I think in terms of books, The New Jim Crow is a good place to start for a lot of people, because even though it's called The New Jim Crow, it really goes back and looks at the history of law enforcement to some degree. One of the things that people don't understand is the history of policing in this country started with slave patrols. And after that, there were the black codes and Jim Crow laws, which specifically targeted black people for petty offenses. And once they were charged with petty offenses, they basically became sharecroppers in a jail or prison setting. That is the explicit history of our country. That is non-negotiable. So when people talk about police reform or police abolition, they're talking about getting rid of an entity that has targeted Black, Indigenous, immigrant people for this entire country's history. And if you look at it from the perspective of people who grew up Black, Indigenous, or immigrant in this country, I think you can understand more why they don't see the police the way that you do. And of course, statistics show that police don't prevent crime. They don't even really solve crime in high percentages. They're just there. And we give them a disproportionate amount of money and power to operate in our system with limited oversight. It's one of the things that I'm passionate about when it comes to schools, because at the school level, kids are pathologized from a very young age. And if you are targeted by police at a young age, seen as a thug or a ne'er-do-well, that police officer or those groups of police officers will likely be in your community as you progress. And they will continue to target you. And they will continue to instigate you to the point where you react negatively. And they'll say, yes, I told you this person was X. But in reality, that person was targeted from the start. That person was pushed to be that. That person's family might not have had the resources to actually give them everything that they need. So they might have looked for resources outside of the law. And they might have been pushed to do that by negative interactions with law enforcement.
So can you, because you are a social worker, I think it's just great to get some information regarding of growing up as a young person of color in these communities with a strong police presence, knowing about historical trauma, knowing about past interactions with family members and community members with the police that haven't been positive. What does that worldview look like as a young person living in that environment and having to deal with not only the environment of poverty and crime and gangs and drugs, but also with a police presence?
I can tell you about my own personal experience. I never really interacted with police in my family. It was something that you avoided. Usually any type of interaction with the police would end negatively. That is what we thought. Historically, that makes sense since the initial police were slave patrols and, they transitioned into the black codes and Jim Crow laws. Growing up as a young person in the South, most of what I saw of the police was in documentaries from the civil rights movement, beating people or showering them with fire hoses, which, I don't think people realize how much fire hoses hurt and bruise and or break limbs, but it's not like a water hose in your front lawn. So my perception of the police as a young person was really based on that. They were people who were trying to hold back progress. As a young person now, and I've heard this, in therapy sessions in South LA, in the Santa Monica Malibu School District, a lot of people think police are basically there to punish people of color. A lot of young students of color think that, and this is reflected because they feel targeted, they feel harassed. I've heard this directly from students both in South LA and in the Culver City School District. In South LA in particular, I got rid of my car about 11 years ago. So when I was working for Community Coalition in South LA, I would often be waiting for the bus on my way home or on my way to work. Oftentimes there are large groups of children waiting with me to go to school or to come from school. And many, many times a large police helicopter would come and hover above us for no reason. There was nothing going on. It was just a bunch of kids talking with each other, laughing with their friends, no violence whatsoever. But the kids were targeted. And, you know, if a helicopter hovers around you on a regular basis when you're amassed with your friends, you begin to see the people that that helicopter represents, the LAPD, as the enemy. If, in addition to that, on your way home, you get pulled over and questioned while you're walking home or driving home if you're an older student by the LAPD when you were doing absolutely nothing on a regular basis, you tend to see them as an enemy, which is why when we see police in schools, we hear from BIPOC students, we hear from queer students that they are targeted, that they are taken out, you know, while they're walking from homeroom to whatever their class is, while they're walking from lunch to their next class, and, you know, really ask questions for no reason whatsoever. And it really sets them on a path, the school to prison pipeline, where they really don't want to be.
And can you break down what the school to prison pipeline is for a lot of people who don't work in the communities or understand that it's a real pipeline, and you can just look at the amount of investment. I mean, last time I looked, it was like $10,000 a year per student versus over $150,000 per locking a kid up, something of that nature. So what's the school to prison pipeline, and break it down?
So the school to prison pipeline is really a system of individual choices and systemic priorities. And by individual choices, I'm really talking about the individual choices of police officers, of school principals, of teachers to target particular students, usually students of color. In the past, it was with things like willful defiance coming from teachers, and the use of willful defiance has been studied and shown to be something that happens disproportionately for Black and brown students, Black and brown male students in particular, but also female students. In addition to that, you know, there's the systemic level where when you look at budgets that are on the county and the state level, we allocate far more funding for prisoners and for the care of prisoners than we do for students. If you prioritize, you know, funding for prisoners, beds for prisoners, prisons over, you know, the production of schools, the creation of community colleges and new colleges, which California has for many decades, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that you will have more prisoners than you have students. And it's something that was really instructive to me in sort of a reflective context. When I was in middle school, both of my brothers were in high school. My older brother graduated. He went to Brown University, Ivy League, blah, blah, blah. He became an engineer and a doctor, and then he got his MBA. My other brother did less well. He might have been less attentive at school, but he was a very smart person and is a very smart person. His senior year, towards the end of the year, he and his best friend got into a fight on school campus. The problem was both of them were 18 at the time. So it was up to the school administrators to mete out punishment. And unfortunately, though they had the option to keep things internal, and just suspend them or, give them detention. They chose to call the police. Now, both of these young men were friends again by the end of the day. I'm not sure if you've ever been young, middle school, high school, having an argument with your best friend. Maybe it becomes physical, but you realize that you actually care about each other. That's what happened in this case. But for both of them, it was the first mark on their record, and it was not the last. It got to the point where I graduated from my undergraduate program in film at USC in the year 2000, 2001. And I saw my brother, and, it was great. I saw my older brother, I saw my older sister, but that was the last time I saw him for about 15 or 16 years. Because based on his arrest when he was a senior in high school, he continued to be harassed. When he would get pulled over, that arrest would show up on his record. So police officers, highway patrol folks would treat him differently. And he would get other charges and other charges and other charges till it got to the point where, he could not successfully and consistently get employment because of the charges on his record, because of the necessity that, at the time, have you ever been charged with a misdemeanor or a felony, not just a felony? You had to check that box. He turned to dealing drugs and spent most of my young adult life in prison. I would occasionally speak to him on the phone, but we developed very far apart from each other. And we're at the point as adults where we barely know each other. There is a huge gap in our life. And there are things that I knew about my brother when he was a teenager. And those are the things that still shape my perception of him right now. And to some degree, I feel like developmentally, that's still sort of where he is. He did not have the time to develop as an adult and make choices. And I really feel like it was that arrest with his best friend towards the end of their senior year that put him on his path. And that's just a small example of the school to prison pipeline with things like willful defiance. Many, many students were suspended from school, and that lack of time spent in school meant that they had bad grades, which meant they were more likely to repeat or fail or be sent to a continuation school because of their grades. And a lot of continuation schools are just full of kids who have done things that, aren't great. It's almost like a training ground, like jails and prisons are. And it's not a place where people can actually catch up. It's not a place where people can actually get the support that was lacking before. What we need is restorative justice. In LAUSD at the moment, there are restorative justice staff members on the books. But oftentimes, these members are tasked with doing things like checking attendance, doing things like calling parents, doing things that are really traditional discipline rather than restorative justice. Some of these folks were tasked to work in the Black Student Achievement Program, but many have not been able to do that work because their principals and administrators give them other tasks. If we are to really successfully disrupt the school to prison pipeline, we need the people who are tasked with and who are paid for things like restorative justice to be able to do that job, to be able to intervene when something happens with an individual, with a young person of color, whether it be their fault or someone else's fault, to try to get them back on the right path. What we're doing now is allocating money for that, hiring people for that, and basically making them do something else, which seems like which makes it seem like the interventions that we prescribed to address the problem don't work. But it's not that the interventions don't work. It's that they are not being implemented in the way that they need to be.
So on that note, I want to go back to, so after high school, did you know you wanted to go on the path of community work and engaging in education and social upliftment? And what did that path look like? And then let's go into your sociology program and study of ACEs.
So when I applied to college, I only applied to two schools. I applied to USC Film School and NYU's Film and Acting Schools. There was a point at which I considered applying to NYU's educational psychology program. And this was really motivated by the great education that I had received at a magnet school in middle school and at an international baccalaureate school in high school. My reflection on that wasn't that, oh, I am great and smart and whatever. It was more that everyone should have the type of support that I received in these programs and the type of opportunities, not only for critical thinking, but also for creativity. I actually moved to Los Angeles to work in the film industry. My undergrad degree is in cinema from USC, critical studies. And shortly after I graduated, I joined the Screen Actors Guild. A few years later, I actually joined the Air Force and Air National Guard, actually for help paying off my student loans. That was my motivator. I joined shortly after September 11th. People often ask me if that was my motivator. I have to tell them no. It was the exorbitant loans that I got from USC as a result of my film degree. While trying to pursue film and joining the Screen Actors Guild and writing screenplays myself and shooting shorts, I became more and more interested in activism and in organizing. And I got to a point where I was working 10, then 20, then 30 hours a week for free for various organizations that focused on either corporate responsibility, the environment, police brutality, or just advocating for more services and a wider social safety net. I didn't even have a really clear idea of what social work was when I applied to UCLA's social welfare program. And I actually applied to a dual degree program in social welfare and public policy. Thankfully, the public policy program rejected me. I say that tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but also very genuinely. I feel like social work is where my heart and my being is, because it really focuses on the people who have the least resources and how to really help them help themselves. Not really in a savior context, but really in a resource and sort of ally context. And that is where I learned about adverse childhood experiences. I had been very interested in education and segregation. And at the UCLA Civil Rights Project, there was a professor there that gave me a book that he had recently written called Educational Delusions, Dr. Gary Orfield. And, I wanted to do a documentary around education and segregation to see what the state of it was 60 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And what I found was that in the South, schools were arguably more integrated. But in places like the Northeast and the West in California, where a lot of the requirements of civil rights acts were not as strong, things were more segregated. And one of the precipitators of that segregation was charter schools. specifically charter schools that seek out the best and brightest. Within the context of educational inequity in this country, the students that often do the best are the ones that have the most resources. In the United States, that's white students. So when charter schools come along, a lot of them were initially marketing themselves as magnet charters. So they would take up the best and brightest from neighborhood schools and take them into charter schools. And this really did double damage. It took kids away from their friends. And it took away the brightest minds that could really impart a type of horizontal learning to the other students. A lot of people think learning is top-down, teacher to student, but a lot of the most effective learning is more horizontal. A lot of students work as translators for other students, for their friends who might not have the same level of intellectual acuity in a specific subject matter area. Not that they're unintelligent, but that they really don't understand the concepts in the way that it's traditionally explained. They understand them more in a way that, you know, a kid might explain to another kid, like, you know, on Pokemon when this happens and that happens, or on Power Rangers, or in the X-Men, or, you know, when Batman does this, you know, like in a language and within a vernacular and a context that's much more immediate and much more digestible.
So what is ACEs, and can you break down when it came about and really how it informs your work today?
So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. They've been common in the social work literature for about 30 to 40 years. And the research on ACEs basically says that if you've had a number of experiences, and most students get an ACEs score, and there's a range, and if you have a high ACEs score, you're more likely to have bad educational outcomes, bad health outcomes, bad job attainment, and a number of other factors that get very specific, like heart disease, like asthma, like a lot of more complex chronic diseases. So if young children and students have their ACEs addressed, they are more likely to be successful, not only in education, but in terms of health outcomes and job outcomes. Many years ago, the Surgeon General of California made a requirement that all school-age children should be screened for ACEs. But one of the things that I would like to address in my campaign, and hopefully in my role on the LAUSD Board of Directors, is what do we do after we get that diagnosis? How do we make sure that these ACEs are addressed? Many of them include things like housing insecurity, malnutrition, domestic abuse, witnessing domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and many of the other things that I mentioned before. If LAUSD took the lead in the context of mental health, which it has tried to do. Many years ago, it said we should open 60 health centers on LAUSD campuses. At present, there are 19. The hours are inconsistent, and they aren't regularly staffed. This is really a component of the community schools model. And community schools basically seek to encompass mental health and physical health and the concept of the whole child in the context of making sure that a student is successful. A student can't be successful if they are hungry, if they aren't getting mental health care or physical health care, if they are housing insecure, if they are being abused physically or sexually. Community schools seek to address not just ACEs, but all of the social determinants of health, which actually have a huge impact on whether or not a student will be successful. So adverse childhood experiences are something that a vast majority of the students in LAUSD experience, because 80 to 90% of the students in LAUSD are Black or Latino. Of those students, about 60% are low income. And most of the recent literature actually says that poverty itself is one of the most damaging adverse childhood experiences. Politically, in this country, poverty used to be a priority. Poverty used to be a priority for Democratic candidates and for Republican candidates. In the last 20 years, our politics have become much more selfish, much more about making sure that I get what I need and less about making sure that other people are protected. A lot of the sociological literature says that when everyone in a society of any size does better, then people individually do better. So when people at the bottom do better, people at the top do better. There is less crime. There is less pollution. There is less, political coups or January 6th and things like that. So it's really something important that we should address, poverty in particular, and it's something that we can address at every level of government. What I'm suggesting in LAUSD is that LAUSD actually uses some of the land that it owns, and some of that is school campuses, for the development of workforce housing so that teachers and staff can actually live affordably close to where they work, but also to develop some of the land that they own that is non-campus land, and or to work with the city of Los Angeles or other local and federal entities to develop publicly owned land for the development of affordable housing so that students in the district and families in the district do not spend a disproportionate amount of their monthly income on housing and or are not homeless. A lot of people think homelessness is visible homelessness, but up to 20,000 students and families within LAUSD have been homeless each year for the last decade. And we can address that by actually working with other governmental entities to build affordable housing, working with nonprofit housing developers to build affordable housing to address that gap, because housing insecurity itself has a profound impact on a student's ability to absorb education. Think about it. If you're living in a car and you're living here and it's fine, or you're living in an RV, but a city bans RVs from being able to camp for a certain amount, you got to move to another city, another school district. Then you move to another city, another school district. And each time you move as a student, you have to make new friends. You have to get used to new personalities. You have to get used to new teachers. You have to get used to new subject matter and new textbooks. It puts you behind over and over and over again, and it sets you up for failure. So a school district that really wants to be as successful as possible and wants to have their students be successful as possible is one that proactively addresses adverse childhood experiences. And the primary tool through which to do that is community schools, which provide mental and physical health support for students. I would like to take that a bit further, though. There is a huge healthcare gap within the United States, within California, and within Los Angeles County. So if community schools were taken to the most extreme edge, which is what I'm suggesting, they would also provide mental health and physical health to community members, whether or not they had children at schools, to make sure that community members are not suffering in silence because they can't afford mental or physical health care. In order to do that, of course, we would have to reallocate funding and have some collaborative funding with the school district and outside entities, whether they be at the LA City, county, or federal level. But the other thing that we would need to do, and a big part of what I talk about when I talk about this race, is we'd have to focus on retention. Retention for teachers who often work at public schools to get some things on their resume and then fly off to private schools because they have more support and less work, but also retention for mental health professionals in schools. I've had my own personal experience working with Community Coalition and the Say Yeah program, South Central Youth Empowered Through Action, going into the schools, speaking with the social workers, and hearing that, yes, I am here today and I will be here Friday, Wednesday and Friday, for example, but on Monday and Tuesday I'm at this school and on Thursday I'm at this school. And each of the schools have at least 1,000 kids. Each of the schools have at least 50 kids who need some type of mental health support. And there is one social worker or one psychologist or 3 or 4. Either way, it is not enough. So in the context of recruitment and retention, I think there should be a very specific focus on retention for teachers and support. And I think we need to do federal advocacy to expand the amount that teachers can be reimbursed for what they put into their schools. I don't know why this hasn't happened at all. But on the mental health point, we really need to recruit more social workers, more MFTs, more psychologists, but give them the type of support that they need to stick around, which means, yes, paying them more, but also making sure that they have the mental health support that they need. Oftentimes, they're hearing about abuse. Oftentimes, they're hearing about sexual abuse. Oftentimes, they're hearing about kids that did not eat this weekend. Oftentimes, they're hearing about kids that had to sleep on the street or in a car. A lot of this is traumatizing, both for students and for staff, whether they be teachers or mental health professionals. And a forward-thinking school district would address all of these things in the community school context with the support that these professionals need to provide the best quality service for our students.
So on that note, I think last time I looked, it was 612 students to one counselor in LAUSD roughly. And that was pre-pandemic. So we had 2 years to meditate on how we want to transform our society and support our youth. I'm sure that number hasn't changed much. And then, the reality is sometimes, let's say a young person's ready to check in or do some healing work and address some of their trauma. If they have a bad experience with a social worker or a therapist, even one time, they might never go back down that road. So how important is it to have competent people talking to young people who can relate to them, who they can really connect with? It doesn't feel clinical. Stepping in kind of like more as the mentor role model, sometimes that's more important than the clinical side. So talk to me about that relationship and supporting young people in that way.
Well, I think it's important for young people to have support that is culturally competent. And that is oftentimes something that's missing both from the mental health perspective and from the mentorship perspective, because a lot of times people, especially young people, they know their family, and their family is usually one race, and it's people that look like them. They are who they know the best. They are who they relate to. Oftentimes their friends will be the same race or color, and it's just easier to get through to them in any way, shape, or capacity, even if it's just establishing a rapport. One of the things that I advocate for is preventive mental health care. And in the best of all worlds, every student would see someone every year, whether or not they were in crisis, so that they would have this experience of knowing that they have someone to go to. If they have a question, if there is something that happened between them and another student, between them and a teacher, between them and a coach, between them and a parent, whether it was big or small, but something that they wanted to talk about. And if it's big, they have someone to go to. The cultural competency is incredibly important. It's something that was lost, frankly, with the integration of schools. And I am a pro-integration person, 100%. But what happened when people started being bused around the country, and particularly here in Los Angeles County with groups like Bus Stop in the Valley, is that a lot of people basically said, I don't want Black or Latino or Asian teachers teaching my students. And in the South in particular, in parts of LA in particular, Black teachers were fired. And those numbers have never really recovered. People can go through their entire experience not having a specific type of teacher. For instance, for me, while I had a number of white, female, Black female, Asian female, occasionally Latina female teachers, I had 2 Black male teachers in my entire K through 12 experience. And one, as you might have guessed, was a PE teacher. The other was a history teacher who also taught cinema lore and showed us Nosferatu in a middle school magnet school, and that was great. But those are paltry examples. For people to really feel comfortable, they need to see themselves, both in the teaching staff and the administrative staff, and most importantly, in a mental health or advisement or mentorship staff. It's something that resonates. And if it's group mentoring, where there are a number of different mentors, even if that person isn't their mentor specifically, just seeing them in the room is something that really provides a lot to people and really shows them an example, because imposter syndrome is real. When you see a doctor, and this was very common for very many years, when you see a doctor on television or in the movies, they're male, they're white most of the time. That has changed a lot in the last 10 to 15 years, and that's a great thing. But growing up, that's what people saw. When you saw an engineer, oftentimes they were white, or they were an immigrant from India or an immigrant from the United Kingdom. And you didn't really see other representation. You didn't see a lot of Latino engineers, for instance. Seeing is believing. It just is. And a lot of times, if you can't see yourself or some part of yourself in someone, it's really hard to take what they say seriously. So it's incredibly important to have those representational figures. And if they aren't available, to have the people who are fulfilling that role be culturally competent. And I don't mean using slang, that's specific to a particular subset of Latino kids or Black kids or Asian kids, but really knowing what the struggle might be, for example, for an undocumented kid, for a Black kid growing up working class in South LA, for a white kid growing up working class in the Valley.
So I want to shift back to your entrance into politics. And I know you were the first African-American to be mayor of Culver City. Is that right? And so talk to me about that experience, getting into that, kind of pulling up the veil and seeing what goes on behind the scenes, as well as some of your major accomplishments you're proud of.
So I never exactly saw myself getting into politics. I came out here, as I mentioned, to work in film and TV. but, I had the type of education that encouraged engagement and critical thinking. I actually went to a hippie magnet school in middle school, and we had classes and seminars in my seventh grade year, and seminars were Monday and Friday, and I took things like Taekwondo and Great Discoveries in Science and Cinema Lore. And then in eighth grade, we did not have seminars or classes. We had streams. And streams were these 9-week periods where we focused on one thing. One stream, the first initial streams were flight, and sixth, seventh, and eighth grade were together, and you built flying machines. Another stream was bridges, and you built bridges. And the history and the math and the science all coalesced around those particular subjects. The stream that I took was elections. And elections, we looked at things like the Civil Rights Act. We watched the entirety of the 20 or 30 hour documentary, Eyes on the Prize. We really talked about controversial subjects, which I guess frankly would be banned in Florida these days. But, we weighed in on those. And that stream was particularly impactful for me. It was the first time I served as a facilitator. We had to work in cooperative learning groups and really more or less work like a lot of community organizations work right now in, sixth, seventh, and eighth grade. But that experience stuck with me, and the sense of responsibility that I got from that and from the examples of my grandmother and mother stuck with me throughout, even though it was focused on arts and entertainment. So I always voted. I always volunteered. In high school, I did 350 volunteer hours. I think we're required to do like 200 or 250. And I continued that when I came to LA. I signed up for LA Works to look for volunteer opportunities. I kept involved. And, there are a couple different things that sort of set me off. A lot of it was environmental degradation that, I knew. As a middle schooler, I sent a letter to the president with petition signatures trying to ban offshore drilling in Florida. That was when I was in seventh grade. And later, I remained active around things like the Sierra Club, which, in the local context is complicated, and I definitely defer to more local environmental justice-based groups, but was very instructive to me when it comes to how to advocate for change on the environmental level. The thing that sort of pushed me over the edge was the Citizens United ruling in 2010. As someone who grew up with both an elections education, like I mentioned in middle school, and a mother who made me and my sister write essays each summer on Black history, which often included civil rights cases, the Supreme Court was always an interest for me. So when Citizens United came down, I read a few articles about it and I was livid, and I didn't have anybody to talk to about it for the most part. Most of my friends were like actors and musicians and directors and physical artists. And then I made a bunch of friends at UCLA Law School, and I was able to talk about it more. And then I heard about Move to Amend, which started basically with the Citizens United case, and I began volunteering for them. And eventually I joined the board of directors of Move to Amend. And we advocate for an amendment to the Constitution that says corporations are not people and money is not free speech. And, we had a number of different initial co-sponsors, Mark Pocan out of Wisconsin being one of them. Our current lead sponsors, Pramila Jayapal out of Washington State. But in the context of thinking about this push for an amendment to the Constitution, which makes a lot of sense for me. You know, you get money out of politics, you get corporate power out of democracy. It's a win. I began to realize that this was unrealistic given the current makeup of our Congress. There are people who would sign on because it sounds good. There were people who would sign on who believed. And then there were people who just wouldn't care because it was unrealistic. And that was with the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives and with the Republican majority in the House of Representatives that we currently have and have had at various times. So in that context, I thought, well, you know, if we're really going to do this, if we're really going to make the type of change that we need to make, then we need more people like me and like some of the other folks that I knew doing the work in positions of elected power. But I did not make the decision to run for office until at one of the city of Culver City's Martin Luther King Jr. celebrations, I heard from a sitting council member at the time that Culver City had never had an African-American council member, vice mayor, mayor. That was sort of astounding because the city was at the time, I believe, 98 or 99 years old. And that was a big motivator for me. As I looked into running a campaign, I also found out that Culver City, like a lot of Western cities, even though the South gets all the baggage, was a sundown town. It was a town where Black people were not welcome. When the sun went down, there were open threats of violence, both from vigilantes and from the police. And it was a place where a lot of the elected officials who were older than me and Black, who've been mentors of mine, drove around. They would rather deal with the LAPD than the Culver City PD. So all of these were motivators for me. I ran the first time. I lost by 134 votes. And I heard from a lot of people who voted for me, but did not come out in full-throated support, that they weren't really sure that I could win because they agreed with me too much. So the second time I ran, I got about twice the number of votes, and I won. And two things really were my priorities in that campaign. One was rent control. At the time, Culver City did not have any rent control, zero rent control at all. And the other was the Inglewood oil field, which is the largest urban oil field in the United States, 10% of which lies within Culver City. I had been organizing with the Sierra Club locally and knew a number of friends who lived in close proximity who had cancer or who had multiple cancers that were common with exposure or close proximity to oil fields. Also, generally, when I grew up in middle school, global warming was real. There was no debate. In fact, when An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's documentary, came out, I was confused because I was like, yeah, this is real. We learned this in middle school. Why are we talking about this? Why do we need a documentary? So now, when we're at this point where people are still arguing that the climate crisis isn't here and climate change isn't real, with historic droughts, with historic hurricanes, with historic rainfall, it really boggles my mind. But that was one of the other motivations for working to close the Inglewood oil field. Because a lot of people don't know, Los Angeles County, you know, it's Tinseltown, but it was built on oil. It was built on oil from the 1800s on. There used to be oil derricks on the beach in Santa Monica. There are still old derricks at shopping centers in Long Beach and at Beverly Hills High School. This entire area is built on oil. But Los Angeles is incredibly influential. And if we were to make a change, then other municipalities and states would follow. And it's incredibly instructive. And I'll just tell you this story real quick. Prior to being elected, the council in Culver City had voted to open 30 new oil wells in the next 15 years, 2 each year. Shortly after I was elected, we voted to actually stop and do an amortization study to see if we could phase out oil drilling. Part of the motivation for this study was actually what was happening around fracking in Pennsylvania and New York. In both Pennsylvania and in New York, fracking was taken over, and there were large restrictions on local municipalities about regulating oil and gas. It was basically out of their hands. It was not in their jurisdiction. It was a state issue. So instead of trying to regulate oil and gas, many of these municipalities and states changed their zoning. And this is how that they were able to start to restrict fracking in their areas. I told this to our attorney at the city that was working on the environment in the Ingle oil field in particular, and asked if there was a way that we could look at this from a zoning perspective. And what she found was that in our section of the Inglewood oil field, it was not zoned for oil operations. And legally, since it wasn't zoned for oil operations, we could give them a timeline through which they could phase out, or they would be required to phase out operations, which is what the amortization study was for. Passing that is one of the accomplishments I'm most proud of, not only because we did it, but because the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles used our same logic to start phasing out oil drilling in their jurisdictions. The timeline in Culver City is currently 7 years. In the city of Los Angeles and LA County, it's 20 years, but they're going through their amortization study in the hopes of shrinking that as well. But I'm incredibly proud of that. We passed rent control. This is one of the other things that LA City copied, because we passed rent control with renter protections. And early this year or late last year, Los Angeles County passed similar rent control with renter protections that really basically align with us. Prior to being elected, I worked with a group of UCLA professors to pass a sanctuary city policy that was stronger and is stronger than that in the city of Los Angeles. And one of the things that I'm most proud of, we did our last year. The prior year, under another mayor, we had issued an apology for the city's history of being a sundown town. But there were a couple of provisions of that apology that just sort of fell by the wayside. One of those was for reparations. So early on in my tenure as mayor, I brought that back before the council. And to my surprise, the vote was 5-0 in favor of moving forward with a reparations policy for the city of Culver City. I think we were in the top 5 or top 10 of cities to move towards reparations at all in the country. And I am incredibly proud of that. One of the things that I hope my former colleagues will pick up is that I also started a participatory budgeting process that would allow the budgeting process to be more open and to actually allocate a portion of funds specifically to be whose use would be determined by the public. I think is incredibly important. Our budget sessions in Culver City are much like the budget sessions in Los Angeles. They are the least attended meetings that we have, but they are the thing that people complain about most. So a participatory budgeting process, fulfills dual purposes. It allows people to make a decision around a specific pot of money and where it goes and how it can benefit the community. But then it also exposes them to the larger budgeting process and allows them to become more informed citizens and possibly to participate more fully in that process. Lastly, one of the things that I am proud of and I'm hoping that other cities will start to implement is that during the pandemic, we started having virtual meetings. As a result, for a number of our meetings with most controversial topics, the number of people at our meetings increased. Sometimes it doubled, other times it tripled. There would be 200-300 people on public comment or on comment for a particular item. And a lot of times it was people who had kids, people who were elderly, who could not make it down to City Hall, people who otherwise would not participate if it had to be in public. So one of the things that I'm glad that I pushed for us to do before I left is to make our meetings permanently hybrid. Not just our council meetings, but our committee meetings and our commission meetings. People will be able to interact in public and virtually in perpetuity. I think there have been a lot of ways in which people who are disabled have been excluded in that context, and specifically people with kids and elderly people who just can't make it to city council. So I'm very glad of that accomplishment.
Really quick, I know we talked about the environment, and can you just break down what environmental racism is and the impacts it has in the community and who's living there?
So environmental racism is incredibly insidious. It is something that is not necessarily a prescribed policy like redlining, but it's a policy patchwork in which places like Superfund sites, oil exploration sites, refineries, auto parts centers, etc., things that produce a lot of pollution, factories, prisons, are situated in low-income communities, and particularly communities of color, Black communities, Latino communities, and indigenous communities in particular. And as a result, the health of those communities suffers. The health of everyone in those communities suffers directly. In fact, in LAUSD District 1, if you look at Cal EPA's tool, Cal EnviroScreen, which is a tool that maps the cumulative impacts of pollution from multiple sources, you will find that LAUSD District 1 is one of the most heavily polluted areas of LA County. A lot of this is because of the legacy of factories that are gone. A lot of this is because of current production in auto body shops. And some of this is because of oil production. This has a negative effect on the brain development of students. And it really makes students be more absent for things like asthma, for things like sinus infections, for things like colds, because they are more likely to get sick because of their proximity to these levels of pollution. And the more you are away from school, the more you are sick, the further behind you become. So these students that are some of the poorest within the LAUSD system are also the most polluted, are also the most sick, are also the most likely to miss school, which sets them up for failure. Outside of just the student population, the sensitive receptors in the community, which are often disabled people or elderly people, are often exposed to this. So their life expectancy decreases drastically. A lot of people will tell you this is because of crime or this or that. When in actuality, a working class neighborhood, an impoverished neighborhood, does not necessarily mean that crime increases. A lot of the reduced life expectancy is due to pollution, it's due to the lack of green space, it's due to the greater prevalence of these adverse health conditions, which, take you away from work, that put you into the hospital, that take you away from your friends and your family.
So obviously in Los Angeles, we're right next to Mexico, and immigration and the Latino community are a big part of the culture and people here. What are your current thoughts on the situation at the border, using ICE, and just give some context to how it all started and where we're at and how we can move forward in a positive way to embrace the people that are here and are coming?
So I think one of the things that we need to remember is that ICE did not exist until the George W. Bush administration, and Customs and Border Patrol were, really doing the job. The Department of Homeland Security in general did not exist as well. And a lot of what we talk about as immigration policy to me is just racist. And it's not a secret. We used to explicitly limit the number of people who could come from Africa, Asia, South America, and really be sort of free flowing with the people who could come from Europe. And if you look at the history of the land that we live on, for generations and generations, California, New Mexico, Arizona, even up to Colorado, they were Mexico. So when the US and Mexico, signed the treaty, a lot of people who had lived where they lived for generations were suddenly immigrants in their own countries. And I think it's unreasonable to think that all of those families should just travel 300, 400, a couple thousand miles to live somewhere else just because some people signed a piece of paper. Our immigration policy is inhumane. The fact is that our economy is really supported by immigrants, not just undocumented immigrants from Mexico, but immigrants from around the world, but specifically undocumented immigrants from Mexico and El Salvador. During the pandemic, people talked a lot about heroes, and we passed hero pay in Culver City for grocery workers and for hospital workers. And I found out recently we were the only jurisdiction in the country to actually pass hero pay for hospital workers. Most people got up to the point and then they were threatened with a lawsuit and they pulled back, but we went forward in Culver City. We were threatened with a lawsuit and it was dismissed. But I say that because in the context of talking about hero workers, we left out farm workers, without which we would have all starved in our apartments. We would have starved. And I'm talking about the people in the fields, but also the people in the slaughterhouses, many of which are also immigrant as well. And when you talk about Los Angeles, the city is about 1/3 immigrant. And that's a mixture of documented and undocumented immigrant. In LAUSD in particular, there are about 19 to 20% of students that are immigrant and mostly undocumented immigrant. In that context, I think the school district should do what Los Angeles County has done recently and create an Office of Immigration Services that has services designed specifically for families that are immigrant or partially immigrant. There are a very large number of mixed families where part of the family is documented and part of the family is undocumented. But if any of those people were to disappear, and if everyone were to disappear on a large scale, like a lot of the ideological racists say they would like, then a large proportion of LA County, California, and the country would cease to function. I think it's a duplicitous, idiosyncratic lack of humanity that keeps our immigration policy from moving forward. I've said in the past that I fully believe that we should have a good guest worker program, because a lot of people who cross the border actually would like to go home on a regular basis. A lot of people who come here because they can make more money comparatively. because the dollar is stronger than the peso. And many send most of that money home. Many don't go home because they don't know if they'll be able to come back here and continue to work to provide for their families at home. But I believe people would if we had a guest worker program. Also, while I support DACA and associated programs, I believe that they are just a pale substitute for comprehensive immigration reform, which includes a path to citizenship, but specifically with this country's history with Mexico, with the large number of indigenous folks who roamed back and forth between parts of Mexico, which are now, as I said, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, etc., and southern parts of Mexico. We should really have immigration policy that recognizes that history and recognizes the current contributions of immigrants and the current struggles of immigrant families.
So one would think after a global pandemic, providing decent quality health insurance, like all the other Western countries do for the most part, America would adopt the same. But doesn't seem like we're going down that track at all, which I'm not surprised. What are your thoughts on that?
One of the most disappointing non-outcomes of the pandemic is the lack of urgency that we've seen at every level of government around healthcare. It's documented, and you can Google the articles and the studies that say that we could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives if we had a single-payer healthcare system when the pandemic hit. A lot of people suffered from the fact that they could not stop working because they would lose health insurance. And it was the fact that they continued working that got them sick. It's shameful. It's shameful. Many of our allies and neighboring countries, many of the countries that we still list as enemies, moved to universal health care in the 50s, 60s, 70s, some the 80s. We should have done it at least 50 years ago. The only reason that we don't is because of the influence of the healthcare industry. And there are incredible follow-on effects to horrible healthcare. I myself have a number of chronic conditions. I take about 15 medications a day. But it took me a very long time to figure out what it is I had, because my healthcare insurance was a patchwork, and I'd have to ask permission from this company or that company to even see a doctor, to even see a neurologist, to see a second opinion neurologist, to see an ENT, to get a biopsy, to get an ultrasound. And these things, if you are sick, if your doctor says you need them, you should get them. That should just be it. For our kids who are developing specifically, one of the things that people don't often mention when they talk about universal health care is the fact that it would include universal mental health care. A lot of kids' social, emotional development was disrupted by the pandemic. A lot of kids who were testing boundaries, who were, seeing how they fit within social structures, within school, without school, with their families. That type of experience stopped cold, and they were by themselves. Or they were by themselves and they saw their friends on video calls, or they texted their friends, but they were not there in person. As a result, when a lot of kids went back to school, there was an increase in aggression. There was a diminished ability to navigate conversations and disagreements and conflicts without resorting to violence. We did not increase the number of mental health providers in schools as we went back, post-pandemic. I don't really think it's post-pandemic at this point, but post-except pandemic, But universal healthcare would have helped us provide that type of mental health support that these students need with such a long disruption of their social emotional development. And, a lot of mental health issues lead to physical health issues, a lot of anxiety and depression, which is incredibly underdiagnosed, specifically in communities of color, leads to bad eating habits, leads to self-harm, leads to bad decision making that results in, physical violence or physical effects. So the more that we delay universal health care in our country, the more that we accept these other problems which result from it. The countries that have the greatest happiness index aren't just the countries where, people get paid more. They're the countries with the more comprehensive social safety net. And a big part of that social safety net is healthcare and mental health care.
So we're going to round this off real quick. So I'm on your website right now, and this is why I was really drawn to hit you up and interview. You say Dr. Daniel Lee, progressive, pro-student, pro-teacher, pro-union, pro-public school, pro-community school, pro-restorative justice, pro-true history, and pro-choice. So what are your goals if you win this election to do in your community?
So my biggest goal if I win this election in the LAUSD District 1 is to try to push for LAUSD to make a plan to turn all schools into community schools. If you look at the literature, whether that's in education or sociology or mental health, you will find that place-based interventions or trauma-informed instruction or community schools, which are not all the same, but which all have similar elements, result in better outcomes for students, period. It doesn't matter what outcome you're talking about. If you're talking about grades, better outcomes. If you're talking about graduation rates, better outcome. If you're talking about mental health, physical health, if you're talking about job attainment in later life, and specifically if you're talking about health and mental health in later life, all of these things can have a better and more profound outcome if students' needs are met while they are in school in a comprehensive way. The problem is the way that most students get these met is by going to a private school or by going to schools like the Harlem Children's Zone in New York City, which is highly financed by Wall Street. It's doing a great job, but most school districts don't have millions and millions of dollars to pour into individual schools each year. It's one of the reasons that the focus of my doctorate study was really on a combination of adverse childhood experiences and place-based interventions, and looking for a more economical way to implement place-based interventions. And I think there are a number of different ways that technology can help us. One of the best ways in which place-based interventions work is the ability to triage students. And, triage is a military term, but when it comes to medicine or when it comes to academics, it's really about people in different subject matter areas of expertise coming together to work together. If you're in a closed system at a private school or a well-funded school like the Harlem Children's Zone, your teacher will meet your mental health provider, will meet your health provider to talk about you specifically on a regular basis, to talk about your progress, to talk about what can be done better or what other supports are needed. And larger systems, this is impractical. But what I focused on in my doctorate program is using technology to make these interactions possible, so that if a student is acting out in class, a teacher can quickly check in with their mental health provider or their physical health provider to see, are they on a new medication? Were they recently diagnosed with something? Are they housing insecure? Is it likely that they did not eat this weekend, as a lot of students do? A lot of students come to school to eat because they do not have adequate resources to eat on a regular basis. A lot of students are incorrectly labeled with willful defiance when a lot of times they are in pain because of an undiagnosed or untreated physical health condition. A lot of students have, undiagnosed anxiety or depression, or they have trauma from witnessing physical or sexual abuse. And these are things that teachers can know, that administrators can know, that health providers can know from a mental health perspective, that could likely prevent these students from being written up disciplinarily and instead they can be connected to the type of resources that they need, whether that be, a food bank for more food for their family, whether that be a social worker, an MFT, a coach, a mentor, whether that be a doctor that actually prescribes them something that can alleviate the pain that they're feeling, but we're not able to express. These are things that can happen when all of these different subject matter area interests that interact with the student and family are able to interact with each other on a regular basis.
Any other main points in terms of your goals for your election? And actually, going back to that, when I asked you why you're running. You said because your colleagues and friends were asking you to. Who was asking you to, and what were their requests?
So after finishing my term as mayor in Culver City, I was looking at whether or not I should run for office in the short term, knowing that ultimately I wanted to run for office again. I was leaning towards not running at all. Then some friends that I knew in UTLA and other friends and community groups like Black Lives Matter and others asked me if I had ever considered running for LAUSD Board of Directors in District 1. I said no, but I did relate to many of them that in my MSW study, I completed a documentary around education and segregation. And in my doctorate study, I focused on education ACEs and place-based interventions. So it has been a passion of mine. It is a passion of mine. And I believe, as I mentioned earlier, I had the benefit of a very good public education in a magnet school and an international baccalaureate program. And the thing that resonated with me the most was the thought that everyone should have the type of opportunity to have the education that I had. That's my primary motivation. But based on some of the work that I did in my environmental justice fellowship with the Liberty Hill Foundation around Cal EnviroScreen, and some of the work that I did at Community Coalition around high need schools, I noticed that there was a distinct overlap between high need schools, which is schools that have a lot of foster kids, low income kids, kids who get free or reduced lunch. Now every kid gets free lunch in California. But kids at schools with high need really overlapped with the heavily polluted areas. And there are a lot of things that education policy usually does not seek to address that I thought needed to be addressed if these students were to ultimately be successful. And, I am the type of person who comes in and says the thing that everyone knows but will not say out loud. And I'm very happy to be that person because you can't change something if you don't speak about it. So what we see in the LAUSD is the inequitable distribution of funds, even with the local control funding formula, even with local control action plans, even with the Black Student Action Plan, Black Student Achievement Plan, the funds are still not going where they need to go as quickly as they need to. They are headlines, press releases, things that are on the books when it comes to policy, but not being operationally implemented. So my passion is to be here to provide not only that oversight to make sure what has already been passed that's, evidence-based, that's supported by research is implemented properly, but also to implement the things that we have known work for 30 or 40 years that we are not doing, that can have incredibly profound positive impacts for students and their families for decades to come.
Finally, this is about providing insight, information, and education to the broader community, especially the young people and their families. So what message do you have for the young people and the next generation and the community as we move and grow in this country of ours?
So I like to say that every school is a community. Every school is a place where there are automatic, natural supports, where there is natural conflict, where there are places of resolution, where there are resources that are being utilized, where there are a lack of resources. And we really need to find a way to work together to make sure that the vast, vast resources of the Los Angeles Unified School District, which has basically a 19 to $20 billion budget and has current reserves of $4.9 billion, is actually being utilized in a way that benefits students. There are always talks of cutbacks, even in years where there are imminent surpluses. There are talks of cutbacks. What we really need to focus on is whether the money that we are putting in and the resources we are putting in are getting the outcomes that we expect, because we know what works. We know exactly what works. If you support kids, if you give them opportunities, for part-time jobs in high school, for mental health support, after-school programs in elementary and middle school, if you give parental support and direction, if parents, need help either with cooking or finding a job themselves or with housing, then families do better. This happens at private schools. This happens at, well-funded schools like the Harlem Children's Zone. It should happen at every school in LAUSD.
Yeah, you talked about the surplus, and you also, what are we spending, 200 million a day in Ukraine? Or, we find money to allocate resources other places, but it's never here. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect in the context of what we value in terms of our priorities. There are a lot of countries that we give foreign aid to, but most of that foreign aid is to protect business interest or to continue to enrich business interest around the world. And we need to stand up as a people in the United States and say, put us first. Don't put America first. Put the people who live in America first. Put the people who work every day to make this country function first, whether that be undocumented people, working class, Black, white, Asian, indigenous people, Mexican and El Salvadorian immigrants from Asia, Europe, South America. Put us first.
Finally, Daniel, where can people find you and how can they support you?
You can find me at danielwaynelee.com. That's DanielWaynelee.com. On Instagram at @TheDanielWayneLee.
All right, perfect. Thanks a lot for your time, Daniel. A lot of valuable insight and information. I think you provided a lot of context and history that people are going to be interested in to help us move forward in the future, and look forward to future conversations. This is Adam Steele with Grow Mentoring. Peace.